So, hello, gentlemen. This is CS MGTOW. My guest today, who joins me, is Professor Michael Mills, and we're going to be discussing sexually dimorphic psychological adaptations, the how and why of sex differences in response to the recent activity within the manosphere about the role of evolutionary psychology in helping to better understand male, female, intergender dynamics. Michael holds a doctorate and is an associate professor of psychology and the former chair at the Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He serves on the editorial boards of numerous journals, including Sexuality and Culture, Evolutionary Psychology, the Journal of Social, Evolutionary and Cultural Psychology, the Evolutionary Review, Art, Science and Culture. Michael, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you here today. Can you introduce yourself briefly and your research and academic focus?
Sure, thanks for having me. Yes, I've taught a course on sex differences for about the past 20, 25 years from an evolutionary perspective, and have done research in that area as well. So my particular interests are in what I call sexually dimorphic psychological adaptations. These are evolved differences between males and females in terms of their emotions, cognitions, perceptions, behavior, and reproductive strategies in particular.
Great. So in the online community known as the manosphere at the moment, there's a lot of debate at the extent to which we can use evolutionary psychology to understand social interactions. So hopefully the discussion today will shed some much needed light and expert opinion on this issue. And there was an excellent article you authored on psychologytoday.com, Michael, titled "Wrong Question, Is It Nurture or Nature?" So I'm going to post a link to this, to this great post so that people can go there as soon as this goes live. And it pretty much summed up the three main schools of thought within the manosphere. So just for the benefit of individuals who are new to the manosphere, firstly, the kind of cultural determinists who believe that the brain is pretty much a blank slate and cultural rights on that. So they believe, for the most part, biology can be ignored when explaining human behavior. The second group are the genetic determinists who believe that the environment can be safely ignored, and people are simply that way based on some kind of a genetic predisposition. And I guess thirdly, the interactionists who believe that to fully grasp human behavior requires an understanding of both biological and cultural causality. So firstly, I would like to outline the basic kind of premise of how we use evolutionary psychology in the manosphere, at least how I see it, and that is that women are the limiting factor in reproduction, and it is the females of our species who make a relatively larger contribution to producing each offspring. And what I mean by that is that for a man such as myself and yourself, Michael, reproduction, I guess, can be limited to just ejaculation. For a woman, it's 9 months of pregnancy and perhaps years of breastfeeding. So so I get this is taken from Bateman's principles, and it's at the root of this thing we call gynocentrism, which is defined as the dominant focus on women and their needs, and this traditionally then develops into something known as feminism. So Michael, I mean, firstly, can you outline from your kind of expert opinion the genetic differences between the human male and female, how and to what extent these genetic differences translate into important anatomical, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral differences, please?
Yeah, well, we know that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and they're identical in males and females, except for the 23rd pair, which we know that females have two X's and males have an X and a Y. And it is the Y chromosome that sets up a cascade of events, primarily hormonal events in utero before birth, that essentially rewires the brains of males from kind of a default female brain organization. And the consequences of this are, follow us throughout our entire life. It's not something that can be unwired very easily, and results in literally males and females having different brains. Males tend to use their brains in a more modular fashion than do females, and females' brain function is more diffuse and spread out. So a male who has a stroke or some damage to his brain, for example, will have a deficit, obviously. A female with the exact same brain problem won't have quite as much trouble because the function in female brain seems to be spread out more.
I see.
Language, for example, is primarily in the left hemisphere of the male brain. It's in both the left and right hemispheres of female brains. And there's lots of other differences. The more we look at the brain, the more we see sexually dimorphic function and structure. In a sense, this derives from the fact that males and females are really what might be called two subspecies within a species. Males and females have different reproductive problems and constraints, and that leads to, particularly in behavior related to reproduction, very different brains in males and females.
Absolutely.
And there's a bit of a backlash against this perspective from some feminists who call this neurosexism. There's a couple books out about that.
Wow, neurosexism? That's incredible.
Yeah. There's, in fact, there's a book. If you go to Amazon and just type in neurosexism, and I think you'll find a couple of books. But the problem that brain researchers and evolutionary psychologists have with many feminists is that feminist theory is pretty much has been traditionally grounded in the theoretical assumption that the brains of males and females are identical, and that there are no sexually dimorphic psychological adaptations. And with the thought that if there are differences, those differences will be used to oppress women or see women in a disadvantaged position. But realistically, I think the evidence is accumulating both in neuroscience, behavioral genetics, and evolutionary psychology that there really are quite significant differences between males and females in terms of their basic natures and having different kind of setups, wiring of the brain.
Agreed. And I guess where those differences also manifest, the adaptations in the way they come out in male behavior don't cause men to oppress women, but cause men to want to provide for women and cause men to want to give women whatever they want, whenever they want it. So the feminists kind of assume that, okay, even if we do have these differences, that they just cause men to want to hold women back for some reason, which I've never quite understood. But actually, it's the opposite we see. Men still want to do things for women, even when, hey, it's maybe not in the male's best interest. The desire to make sure that every woman lives on board a sinking ship, and women get on the life kind of rafts ahead of the males. These are deeply conditioned parts of the human, based on the fact that we, that as you said, we're almost two subspecies of the same species. Would you agree with that, or is that a little bit off?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part of your question. Could you repeat that?
Sure thing. No, I was just saying that I guess feminists believe that if there are any differences, these differences somehow predisposition the males to oppress the females, but actually we see the opposite of it in the interaction between the genders.
Yes, I would agree with that. We're getting into some pretty politically sensitive and politically incorrect territory here.
Okay.
But females, especially females that are fertile, say between the ages of 17 and 35, are a very, very valuable reproductive resource to males, and males compete very intensely for sexual access to females within that age range. And that gives females who are fertile some pretty powerful sexual leverage, or what is called erotic capital. They have a great deal of power over heterosexual men.
Great.
Because females are basically the gatekeeper to male reproduction. For a male to reproduce, he has to get at least one female to consent to have sex with him, and otherwise he's going to not reproduce at all. And from an evolutionary perspective, that is worse than, let's say, worse than death, actually.
Agreed.
So I think that females have a huge amount of power, and the fact that that males are willing to help them and to financially support them is evidence of that power. There's a bit of irony in that I think what some feminists perceive as a male desire to oppress women, that is presumably due to some nefarious, ill-defined patriarchy. It's really based on male biology. Men want to have access to a woman, and also men have a problem with what's called paternity insecurity. They want to it's not good enough just to have a female consent to have sex with you. If you want to invest in your own offspring, you have to convince her as well to forego sex with other men.
Exactly.
So in order to do that, there's pretty much a trade-off. I mean, the relationship or marriage contract pretty much goes something like this, if you wanted to really simplify it. A male comes up to a female and says, do you want to have sex? I noticed you have high reproductive value, you're very fertile, and I'd really like to reproduce with you. Of course, guys don't say that in reality, but it's kind of the underlying motive. And females say, I've got many options here. There's many guys who would like to reproduce with me. What do you have that would help me in that endeavor? Would you stick around? Would you abandon me afterwards? Would you leave me to raise the kids by myself? What resources do you have? Are you willing to share those resources with us? And she says, I'm not, until you tell me and demonstrate to me, actually, acts speak louder than words. Anybody can say, I love you. But, courtship is about the process of demonstrating pretty much to a female that a male is a worthwhile suitor.
Certainly. It's almost a demonstration of his utility or his proposed future utility to her.
Exactly. And, the problem is that males can assess female fertility visually, and they can do so very, very rapidly in just a fraction of a second. For females, it's just not what a guy looks like, although that's important. It's a lot of other attributes that take a long time for females to assess. Males are interested in mating with multiple females, and so what many females are looking for is a guy who finds her special and is truly in love with her, and in fact will stick around and will not abandon her. So that's what a lot of the courtship ritual is really ultimately about.
Okay.
And so, if the male demonstrates these things, she'll say, okay, well, I'll have sex with you if you stick around. He says, sure, I'll do that, but there's just one more thing that I want from you, and that is, I want to know that any offspring that you have are genetically my own. So I want you to be faithful to me. Will you do that? And she says, well, okay, I will, as long as you support me and our offspring. So then they've got what's basically a marriage contract, and that essentially works for humans and for virtually all other species that where males invest in offspring as well. You find the same dynamics occurring.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, you raised a really important kind of issue there, that for men, for sure, we're looking for, markers of genetic fitness. So whether that's bust size, waist to hip ratio, youth. These are the things we look for. And within the human female, they're hardwired to look for the provisioning, of the male, the kind of safety and security. So hypergamy is a huge topic within the manosphere, the desire of the human female to attract a higher status male for pair bonding. So, in your opinion, is this a trait? Sorry, is this trait an evolved psychological adaptation, a byproduct of an adaptation, or really just kind of a random variation within the species?
I would say that the female preference for high status, powerful, wealthy males who are willing and able to protect her, who are leaders among men, that is a strongly sexually dimorphic adaptation. So females are kind of pre-wired to engage in hypergamy.
Agreed.
And in fact, around the world, you find that they do. Females tend to marry upward in social status
For sure.
around the world. And we also see this in other species as well.
I see. What I find particularly interesting, Michael, is that I guess a lot of individuals, probably including myself before I really started researching this stuff, would have assumed that the more mechanized a society kind of became, as women could work and were in many professions out earning males, that the hypergamy would be suppressed, or that it just wouldn't be such a factor. But actually it's become almost more pronounced as society has developed. So now let's say you have a female doing very well, earning, let's say, 150 grand. She won't look for a guy, okay, you get the odd kind of exception, but she won't consider most guys earning 100 grand. Now it's got to be a guy earning 200 grand or 250 grand. So, it's very interesting that actually that hasn't gone away. So even the developments of the species can't go against our basic biology, as it were.
Yeah, there's a theory called the structural powerlessness hypothesis, I believe it's called, which argued that the reason that females are interested in engaging in hypergamy is because they're discriminated against in terms of income and jobs and career advancement and so on. And that once that equalized, women would no longer be interested in men who made a lot of money, and we would see hypergamy evaporate. In reality, that's not the case. What you find is, as females gain in social status, in terms of education, in terms of their income, in terms of their career status, the pool of eligible men actually decreases for them. They are looking for men who are even higher up in the social hierarchy than they are. So one study that was done looked at female medical students, and instead of, presumably they're going to be making a pretty good salary once they graduate, and thus that should be less important to them in a potential partner if hypergamy didn't have an effect. But in fact, these women are looking for men who will make even more money and have higher status than they have. So hypergamy is built in, and women indeed do discriminate, if you want to call it that, against men who they perceive as lower social status than they are.
For sure. And I guess another one of these, anatomical adaptations is that, for example, on average, research suggests that the males have a higher density of neurons in the cortex, roughly 35,000 more per square centimeter. This in combination with the fact that the average brain volume in adults is 10 to 15% larger than the average female brain volume. This kind of endows men with a higher information storage and processing capacity. So I guess I would love to find out from your kind of vantage point, what pressure leads to this particular dimorphism and the within sex variability differences of men and women within this kind of context?
Well, there's two things we can look at. Excuse me. We can look at the the mean scores on IQ between men and women, the average scores, and they're pretty close together. There's some research that suggests that men might score 1 or 2 IQ points on average higher than females. And the second difference is in variability among IQ scores. And here we find, for genetic reasons that I won't go into right now, that on many traits, males are more variable than females are on X-linked traits, that X chromosome trait. And IQ appears to be somewhat X-linked. And so we find many more males at the tails of the distribution, extremely intelligent men or extremely unintelligent men. And this is basically what Lawrence Summers had to say that got him in so much trouble. He didn't say that men are smarter than women. He said that men are more variable than our women in terms of IQ.
Agreed.
Yeah, and thus that explains why at the very top of the distribution, for example, in terms of mathematicians, you're probably going to find more men than women simply due to that greater variability. But another thing that I don't think a lot of people realize or think about is that intelligence isn't just one thing. It's multiple things, different cognitive capacities that we have. And my sense is that males and females have different types of intelligences.
Agreed.
Males may have what Simon Baron-Cohen calls systemizing intelligence, where they try to figure out solutions, problems that don't necessarily involve people, whereas females may have more empathizing types of intelligence, where they can pick up nonverbal cues, facial expressions, and so on more readily than males can. So I think that males and females are different, probably in the very components that make up IQ. And so you're going to likely find differences in certain types of intellectual performances between males and females, and also you're going to find differences in preferences. People generally like to do things they do well.
Agreed.
And that's a little different for males and females, and they're naturally going to kind of find themselves or find attractive different types of situations, including employment situations.
Agreed. Which is actually really, really interesting, because I guess the kind of standard line that I hear, and you probably hear a lot today, is that, hey, look, we don't have enough women in the STEM fields, the science, technical, and medical fields. And of course, men are still earning the majority of degrees within these fields. Women earn for sure the majority of degrees within some of the social sciences. And it's the kind of standard line we hear that, hey, women aren't being encouraged, or they're being systematically, discriminated against. But actually, could the cognitive dimorphism actually be the driver here, as opposed to systematic, institutionalized, discrimination?
Yeah, if you take the position that male and female brains are identical, then you're going to interpret any differences between males and females as due to discrimination. If, in fact, male and female brains are different, you cannot make that presumption that it's due just to discrimination. It could be due to differences, as we've been talking about, in different types of intelligences, differences in terms of different types of preferences. And I agree with you with respect to the STEM occupations. In general, those occupations involve less kind of human contact and more of a systematizing cognitive functions. And also, if there's more variability among males and females, some of these fields require very high intelligence levels. To be a mathematician, you've got to be 3, 4, 5 standard deviations above the mean in terms of IQ. And it's just a fact that proportionally there's more men than women out at that range. Now, of course, on the other end of the continuum, that's true as well. But as a society, we've got several options. We can say we're going to demand equal representation, in which case we would have to discriminate against men. To do that, we would have to give women extra incentive and extra rewards to go into the STEM occupations. Or we could just treat men and women equally. And you'll find, differences in proportions. It's not going to be equal representations out of the tail.
Of course, absolutely. Well, actually, I mean, when they do have affirmative action programs, and they make I've forgotten what they call them, the scholarships for women to, hey, come and study the STEM fields. The numbers of women actually still going into the STEM kind of occupations is never as high as men, just simply because they don't have a desire to be in those fields on average. You do get for sure some women who enjoy it, but most women don't desire to, perhaps
right.
be a particle physicist.
We hear a lot of gnashing of teeth and claims about discrimination of women in STEM fields, but we don't hear the same in a parallel sense that we need more men in positions of teaching elementary school children.
Exactly.
And the reason that there are few men in that occupation is because, quite frankly, I mean, women are more interested in young children and interacting with them on average than is the typical man.
Exactly. It certainly has nothing to do with discrimination, or at least institutionalized discrimination, but more about human preference. Some people prefer to be particle physicists. Some people prefer to work with younger children. There's nothing wrong with that. Unless we assume that women and men are both identical, then of course we can say, hey, look, this is terrible, that there's got to be some kind of nefarious reason behind this, as opposed to simple human choice driven by the underlying biology.
And as Christina Hoff Sommers has pointed out, this is pretty much the difference between what she defines as gender feminism, that presumes the differences between men and women are due to discrimination and that the brains of men and women are identical, versus equity feminism, which doesn't make that assumption and, is more accommodating. That, well, if men and women have different preferences, they should be free to do what they want to do without society trying to engineer, exact equality in the number of STEM professionals and the number of elementary school teachers that are men and women.
I agree. And Michael, I guess I'm by no means an expert here, but I've seen quite a couple of theories try to explain why humans tend to place the well-being of women and young children at the forefront of social interactions, and why we value women's well-being so highly. So one, of course, holds that, in an underpopulated world of the past, wombs were very, very precious, and of course a key resource to human survival. Hence that kind of genetic predisposition towards gynocentrism was a survival advantage. However, and I guess my question to you is this: with the current overpopulation that we have in the world, and even that is, I guess, a bit of a loaded statement. Some people will say, hey, it's overpopulated, some people will say no. But wombs are now very, very plentiful. But our biological predisposition still makes us overvalue them. So, is gynocentrism in its current form, that expresses in romantic love, chivalry, and possibly even the kind of welfare state that we have, is that simply a passing fad in the human evolutionary process, in your opinion?
Well, there's... if these are based on evolved psychological adaptations, and I think that they are, this is not something that's going to go away quickly or easily. Even if women have been made economically equal to men, they don't need men's help as much. I mean, basically the government provides to women what husbands used to provide. In terms of, there's police protection. Before, in the ancestral environment and tribal life, you relied on your husband and father and boyfriend. I'm not, well, maybe if you're not mated with boyfriend. Or you had your brothers, and they took care of you. They protected you. And today you've got the police. we have welfare states. So if women have children, the children aren't going to starve, and the women, to some extent, are going to be taken care of. But yeah, I think that which I think you referred to as gynocentrism, is pretty much part of our evolved biology, and it's going to be women and children first when the ship is sinking for quite some time in the future. And I think we need to be cognizant of this and make sure the pendulum doesn't swing too far in the opposite direction.
For sure.
That we are we're less concerned about the welfare of men than we are about the welfare of women. That certainly is not a humanistic perspective.
Agreed. Especially in this day and age of equality, because what we're all looking for is equality between the genders, as opposed to being driven so hard by our biology that we forget the needs of one half of the human species. Michael, I would love to kind of bring in the role of the amygdala for those who are, I guess, unaware of the amygdala. It's about the size of an almond, and it's positioned just inside the brain's front surface. It creates a pressure to behave in a certain manner that the amygdala kind of adjudicates as conducive to the long-term biological survival of the species. So what the research shows is that males are less subject to mental predisposition in general, and less subject to, I guess, to amygdala tyranny in particular. Can you kind of speculate to why is this the case, and why this might have been selected for in such a way?
Okay, well, I think in general we can talk about the limbic system, which includes the amygdala, which is basically the center for producing motivation and emotion in men and women. And, in both men and women, a lot of these dictates that we have that come from the primitive parts of the brain are in conflict with social norms and our own long-term interests. So the limbic system is in conflict with the cerebral cortex, particularly the frontal lobes, which try to inhibit the behavior of these more primitive parts of the brain. Sometimes it's said that women are more emotional than men. I'm not a real expert. I'm not too sure whether that's due to brain differences. Certainly women have used emotion successfully to solicit aid from friends and kin. And we see this even in young babies before they've had time to be socialized. When little infant girls are presented with some sort of frustrating situation, they tend to start crying before the males do. The males keep trying to solve the problem longer before they resort to that. In general, with reflection on the gynocentrism you were referring to earlier, women can expect to get more aid from their friends and relatives than men can. So if emotion is a way to solicit aid that is effective, women will use it more than men. And I think someone said that there's nothing more powerful than the tears of a woman.
Agreed.
Where we see a guy crying and we think, oh gee, what a loser, what a wimp. And this perhaps also comes from the fact that in ancestral times, human males hunted, and to be a member of a team, to subordinate your own needs and emotions and weaknesses to the larger good of the group, it was very important. And if you wanted to be a member of a tribal, for example, hunting party, you had to show that you were tough and that you could do as you were told in terms of the hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And for females, there was less of a hierarchical structure like that. And the consequence is that the males tend to feel emotions, but they tend to suppress them more than women do. And they have more difficulty talking about them. And one theory about that is that since women have verbal capacity in both hemispheres of the brain and perhaps a bigger corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres, apparently emotion is cognitively analyzed in the right frontal cortex. And to verbalize that, you have to get that information over into the language center in the left hemisphere. And this is pretty speculative, but one theory is that since women have a bigger corpus callosum and more language capacity in the brain, it's easier for them to report on their emotional state. And we might speculate that men might have an equally emotional state, but have more difficulty verbally expressing it. If you ask a woman, what are you feeling? Generally, they can tell you right away what they're feeling. Many men, if you ask them, what are you feeling right now, they kind of give you a quizzical look as if you were kind of crazy. They will often say nothing.
Absolutely.
But in fact, they might be feeling a lot. So men might have difficulty expressing and verbalizing emotion. But I don't know if they have less of it than women.
I agree, and that seems a very plausible theory on it. And then I guess, that's further selected for because the culture kind of creates an atmosphere where men understand they won't be listened to the same degree, or their pleas won't fall on such fertile ground versus, let's say, the human female. So again, they'll be less likely to engage in sharing emotions. I saw a very interesting study a couple of years ago, and unfortunately I've forgotten the name of the researcher, but they showed that that they had a nursery setting, and the young girls were more likely to be picked up when crying versus the young boys. They were about 5 or 6 months old or something. So very, very young children. So the human female then understands immediately, hey, crying or at least showing emotion gets results. It gets things done. And from a very, very early age, there's perhaps a level of conditioning with the human male that actually crying doesn't get you very far, and actually may even be counterproductive. So that then I guess, hey, over a period of time, that's then further selected for as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think you're spot on.
Great. And I guess one of the things I see debated within the manosphere is the extent to which social norms change biological propensity. Can you kind of shed light into how this process takes place and how this gets ingrained into what society deems appropriate, and how this then I guess further reinforces biological propensity?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, the nature versus nurture debate is the wrong way to phrase the problem. It's always nature via nurture or nature-nurture interactionism. And let me give you just one example of that. And that is, as I mentioned earlier, that human males are never certain 100% who their genetic offspring are. And they risk misdirected parental investment, which is extremely costly from an evolutionary perspective. So men have this problem with paternity assurance. Men around the world want their long-term reproductive partner, their wife, their girlfriend, in general, to be sexually faithful to them. Now, how that is manifest behaviorally and culturally across the world differs substantially. There are some things that men do to try to assure their paternity or increase the probability of it that women don't do. And some of these are fairly subtle behaviors. Some of them are pretty extreme. Some things that men do to identify a woman as his woman and essentially tell other men don't get any ideas is, men tend to put their arm around women, hold your girlfriend's hand. And they're more often to do that in public, which is a signal to other men, she's mine, she's taken. Rings, wedding rings, engagement rings, Western culture, I don't even think men get an engagement ring, and women get one. That, at least in the United States, it's supposed to cost them 3 months of his annual salary. I don't know if that's fair.
It's a very large.
Taxes.
It's a very large amount.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a signal to her that I have resources and I'm serious and I'm investing in you. But it's also a signal to other guys. There's a ring on her left hand on her third finger, her ring finger, and that indicates that even though if I'm not there at the moment, if you try to mess with her, I'm not going to be very happy. Wedding rings are worn more frequently by wives than by husbands. There's other things in different cultures. This male tendency to try to protect their paternity manifests itself differently. For example, the burqa is one way. If you don't want other men to see what your woman looks like, what her waist-to-hip ratio is, or what her breasts look like, you literally put her in a bag, and you can't even see her face. In some cultures, they engage in what is called female circumcision or clitorectomy. And this is often performed by the girl's own family, her mother typically. At puberty, they remove the woman's clitoris because if a woman can experience sexual pleasure in that culture, she's not considered marriageable. So there's, and in some cultures, most of the many cases of homicide that involve a love triangle, involves a man killing a rival man. Spousal abuse, particularly wife abuse, is at least 2/3 of the time, I think, related to male jealousy.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that at all. Wow.
Yeah. So, women get jealous too, and they have their own reproductive interests. What they don't want to have happen is they don't want to have their man taken away by another woman and lose his investment. And but they don't have to worry about whose child is coming out of their vagina. That's pretty clear. So the point here is that we have these underlying evolved dimorphic adaptations that operate at the level of unconsciousness for most of us. Most men aren't thinking, oh, I'm concerned about my maternity. Most men, when they are horny or when they want sex, are not thinking, oh, gee, I'm trying to increase my reproductive success. These adaptations operate in the more primitive parts of the brain, like you mentioned the amygdala, in terms of motivations and emotions and desires and aversions. And these kind of bubble up from below, and we don't know why we feel what we feel. If you ask people why they feel what they feel, usually they won't give you the correct answer. They don't know why, they just feel what they feel. And then this bubbles up to behavior. And in different cultures, how these adaptations, emotions, motivations, desires, aversions, manifest in a particular culture is going to differ depending upon, the values and the history and so on of the culture. So we find something like paternity insecurity can be expressed very differently from a burqa in Afghanistan to holding hands and rings in the Western world.
Agreed.
So there's, these adaptations that we have are not set in concrete. They can be modified. But what I would suggest is that the fundamental emotions and motivations are pretty difficult to change, are resistant to change. And they're also hard to change because we're not even aware of them.
Agreed.
So if we really want to understand why males and females act differently, we have to understand these underlying differences between men and women.
Agreed wholeheartedly. And actually, you brought up the topic of the burqa a little bit earlier on, and I just find that such a fascinating topic because, for sure, on one side, it's as you said, possibly the Middle Eastern equivalent of, let's say, the wedding ring. So it allows the man to signify, kind of quasi ownership of the female. But I guess also on the female side, because men are, we're hardwired to be very, very visual. So we look for markers of genetic fitness, whether that's youth, whether that's a certain hip to waist ratio or something, or a certain bust size. So the burqa acts in a way to increase the value of a woman, because I believe in the cultures where the burqa is used, that the men aren't allowed to see the woman outside of the burqa until they're fully married, and now it's the wedding night. So actually, he can't then, as a man, go through the usual kind of, I guess, possibly the inspection of women. Okay, what's her bust size like, and does she have bright red lips? Or all of the kind of markers of genetic fitness that men are very, very hardwired to use. So that's a bit of an interesting one for the guys. So I guess it benefits the females as well as benefits the men, and in a particular dynamic over there as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I haven't heard that before. I agree that there are benefits to women in that sense. It reduces the probability of a male infidelity to some extent, because you can't even see the female, and it gets men to invest the promised investments before they know what they're getting, in a sense.
Exactly.
Which could be in a female's interest.
It could be. I guess it's massively in the interests of females who wouldn't be immediately sexually desirable by the majority of men. Men, I guess, we're driven to look for young, fertile, physically attractive women. So a woman who maybe isn't as physically attractive would benefit far more from a burqa.
Right. I think that. I think just the face alone, there's probably a whole lot of information there about relative fertility. But you're right, there's additional information below the neck that most men would like to evaluate before going further.
For sure. Evaluate very closely, I guess. For sure.
Right.
And I guess my final question to you is, what are the some of the other unique problems that men and women have, and how does evolutionary psychology really help us to understand some of these unique strategies that men and women will use to solve these problems?
Yeah, men and women have a fundamentally different set of reproductive problems to solve. For women, they only have a relatively small window of fertility available to them, of prime fertility, maybe 15 years. And they have to find a mate, and not just any mate. They want a mate that has good genetic quality. And from a woman's perspective, they want a mate who has resources and status and that can protect her and her offspring. And these things are hard to evaluate. So courtship from a female perspective is a very serious business, and it takes a long time, which is why women are so sexually coy relative to men if they're interested in a long-term relationship. And from a male perspective, men are inclined, men have two problems. The first problem is getting females to have sex with them because they can't reproduce otherwise. And the second problem, as I mentioned before, is making sure that they're in fact your own offspring, so assurance of paternity. So men are looking for fertile females. They can assess female fertility very rapidly, visually. And they're, unfortunately, I guess to some extent, they are looking for polygamous mating systems. Most men would prefer to have multiple mates.
Yes.
Because each new mate increases the number of potential offspring that he could have, which doesn't bode too well for monogamy. The reason that females like, wedding day is a very important day for most females. If she's marrying a prince, that's pretty cool. She's pretty well set for life. Yeah. And men, at particularly bachelor parties, tend to balk at the idea of monogamy. And women interpret this as men are afraid of commitment. It's not that men are afraid of commitment. They're afraid of committing to a woman's level of potential reproductive output, which is lower than a man's. So, and men would like to commit with as many women as they could possibly commit with.
Agreed.
So it's not the problem with commitment. It's polygamy that men are interested in. And the second issue, of course, is to the extent that you can get it, making sure that your wife or wives don't have sex with other men. And men who are powerful, wealthy, or ruthless dictators have virtually always translated that power into having multiple wives and multiple children with high probability of paternity. And these two fundamental differences, what we call reproductive rate, males faster than females, and assurance of genetic parentage, females greater than males, these are the two most fundamental differences between the sexes. And there are many differences that are derivative of those two differences. And so men and women do face a very different set of reproductive problems.
For sure. I guess assurance of genetic, lineage, assurance of paternity is so important to the human male that we even have an anatomical adaptation, and that the penis, that the male penis is shaped, and apparently, as far as I understand, or the theory is that the shape itself, the head of it, is designed so that when a man inseminates a female, as it's kind of pulling out of the vaginal canal, it's scraping semen from other potential competitors who may have just actually copulated with her. So this assurance of paternity is so kind of hardwired into the human male, and you're completely right that will certainly lead to things like wedding rings and holding her hands in public. And it's amazing that we equate those things to romantic love. Well, actually, we're driven very, very hard by our biological instincts there.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. What we call romantic love really has to do with successfully producing children, or at least how it was done in ancestral times.
Another debated issue in the manosphere is the rise of MGTOW, men going their own way in the West, and the grass eaters in Japan. What caused these movements? Many speculate that social conditions, female expectations, and possibly unjust laws led to men abandoning marriage. While I concede they play a part, I think we can also look at the basic pressures and drivers of our species for explanation. I speculate that for long periods in our evolution, a combination of limited number of humans and the high cost of the human female associated with sex outside of a long-term pair bonding created the need for monogamy. Along came the sexual revolution, an explosion in the human population, and a highly mechanized society where women could participate in the labor force. And MGTOW might have come naturally, even without the mess of the family courts and hypergamy. So I don't think I'm going to be too popular in the manosphere for saying this. But Michael, it's been a tremendous pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so very, very much.
Oh, my pleasure. I'd be happy to chat again.